When my husband passed away, it felt as though the entire world had suddenly lost its color. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days, each hour weighed down by a heaviness I couldn't shake. It's remarkable how a single person can be so intertwined with your daily rhythm that once they're gone, even the simplest acts, like pouring a cup of coffee or sitting at the kitchen table, become sharp reminders of what you've lost. The silence in our home was deafening. I would catch myself expecting to hear the jingle of his keys by the door or his voice calling out to me from the hallway, only to be met with a hollow stillness. For weeks I kept myself busy with the usual formalities, handling paperwork, speaking to lawyers, dealing with condolences that, while heartfelt, often left me feeling even lonelier. Friends and relatives came by with casseroles and warm embraces, their eyes full of sympathy. But when the visits slowed and the calls became less frequent, I was left alone with memories that sometimes comforted me, sometimes felt like salt on an open wound. Eventually, I reached a point where I could no longer avoid facing the future. One of the lingering tasks was dealing with my husband's old garage. It sat at the edge of our property, a weathered structure that had been part of our lives for decades. To be honest, I had always considered it his domain. He would spend hours tinkering there, fixing up lawn mowers, restoring old furniture, sometimes just sitting in the afternoon light with a cup of tea. It was more than just a storage space. It was his little kingdom, filled with the comforting clutter of half-finished projects and tools that only he knew how to use. Approaching the garage stirred up a complex mix of emotions. Part of me dreaded it, fearing the flood of memories that would come rushing back. Another part of me wanted to preserve it exactly as he had left it, like a museum dedicated to the life we had shared. But reality has a way of pushing you forward whether you're ready or not. Financially, it made sense to sell it. The property had value, and the upkeep was becoming too much for me alone. The morning I decided to start the process, I stood by the old wooden door for a long time, my hand resting on the handle. I think I was hoping, just for a heartbeat, that if I waited long enough, I might hear his voice from the other side telling me to come in. Finally, I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The familiar scent of sawdust and old oil greeted me instantly, and my eyes swept over the shelves stacked with paint cans, the workbench littered with nails and sandpaper, the wall where he'd carefully hung his wrenches in descending order. It was as though time had frozen in there, faithfully holding on to the essence of the man who once made it all come alive. As I stepped inside, I realized how unprepared I truly was for the tidal wave of memories. Every object seemed to whisper a story. The dented coffee mug on the shelf, his favorite. The little radio perched by the window, still set to his preferred station. The more I looked, the more I felt a gentle ache settle into my chest. I understood then that letting go of this place wouldn't just be about selling a building. It would be about releasing a part of our life together, acknowledging that chapter had ended, and somehow finding the strength to turn the page. Little did I know, the garage still held a final secret, one that would forever change the way I remembered my husband and the life we had shared. The garage was always one of those places I didn't pay much attention to. It was my husband's space, a sort of sanctuary where he could retreat from the world and immerse himself in whatever little project had captured his interest that week. I used to tease him about how chaotic it looked from the outside, boxes stacked high, old tarps thrown over who knows what, tools scattered like confetti across every surface. But to him it was organized chaos. He could lay his hands on any screwdriver or bolt without missing a beat. It was his domain, and I was content to let it stay that way. Stepping inside after so long felt like trespassing. The air was cool and smelled faintly of grease and cedar, a scent so uniquely tied to him that it made my chest tighten all over again. Sunlight filtered through a cracked window, casting long golden beams across the clutter, making the dust in the air dance like tiny spirits. I stood there for a while, letting my eyes wander over the familiar mess. Each corner of that garage seemed to be holding a memory hostage. There was his old workbench, scarred and stained by years of use. Little pencil notes were still scribbled along the edge where he'd jot down quick measurements. Above it hung a pegboard full of wrenches, hammers, and pliers. Each tool hung with such deliberate care that you could almost hear his voice reminding me, jokingly, a place for everything, and everything in its place. Beside it sat an ancient toolbox, red paint peeling, handle worn smooth from countless afternoons of tinkering. I ran my fingers over it, half expecting it to be warm from his touch. Further in, cardboard boxes were piled high, sagging under the weight of old car parts, tangled extension cords, and God knows what else. I caught sight of a faded toy truck on one of the shelves, dusty wheels frozen in time. That little truck had been a gift from him to our son, who had long since grown up and moved away to build a life of his own. Seeing it there, forgotten among the clutter, brought a bittersweet smile to my face. It struck me how the garage wasn't just a workshop. It was a silent archive of our family's story, holding onto pieces of the past we'd all but forgotten. Against the far wall, stacked beneath a heavy tarp, were what looked like old wooden crates. I remembered how he loved scouring estate sales for curiosities, antique hinges, brass fixtures, bits of wood he swore he'd turn into something beautiful someday. I used to roll my eyes at these treasures that ended up gathering dust, but standing there now, I realized each piece probably had a story he would have gladly shared if I'd only thought to ask. Everywhere I looked, I was confronted by fragments of his personality, his patient craftsmanship, his playful curiosity, even his tendency to keep things just in case they'd be useful later. It was a room so thoroughly saturated with him that for a moment it almost felt like he was there with me. I half expected to turn around and find him leaning against the doorframe, wiping grease from his hands, ready to tell me about his latest project with that familiar spark in his eyes. I think what surprised me most was how alive the space still felt, even though he was gone. It was as if the walls themselves were holding on to his laughter, his quiet humming as he worked, the muttered curses when something didn't quite fit. And in that gentle chaos, I felt both a pang of loss and an odd sense of comfort. This garage, once so ordinary and overlooked, was a living testament to the man I loved, his dreams, his passions, his quiet joys. Little did I realize, as I stood there surrounded by all these echoes of our past, that the garage had one more secret to reveal, one that would turn my quiet moment of remembrance into something far more profound. As I continued to explore the garage, brushing aside cobwebs and shifting boxes that hadn't been moved in years, I stumbled upon something that stopped me cold. It was an old wooden trunk, tucked away in a dim corner behind a stack of rusted garden chairs and a roll of fencing wire. The trunk was surprisingly elegant despite the dust, with iron handles and a curved lid that gave it a sort of antique charm. I didn't remember ever seeing it before, though that didn't entirely surprise me. My husband was always bringing home odd finds, promising me they were special even if I couldn't see it at the time. At first, I just stood there, staring at it. My mind was already swirling with possibilities. Maybe it held nothing but junk, or maybe it was packed with old rags and useless scraps he'd meant to sort through one day. Part of me didn't want to open it at all, afraid of what memories or regrets it might stir up. But curiosity has a way of nudging you forward, even when your heart hesitates. I bent down, wiped away a thick layer of grime, and lifted the latch. It creaked loudly in the quiet, as though protesting being disturbed after so many years of rest. When I finally opened the lid, I nearly lost my breath. Inside were bundles of neatly tied letters, stacks of photographs, and what looked like a small velvet pouch. My hands trembled as I picked up the first bundle of letters. The envelopes were yellowed with age, edges curled and delicate. Each one was addressed in my husband's familiar handwriting, but they weren't addressed to me. That sent a strange shiver through me until I realized they were all simply marked with years, like a private journal written in the form of letters. Letters to himself, to our son, to a future he never got to see. My mind raced with questions. I settled onto an upturned crate and carefully untied one of the bundles. The first letter I pulled out was dated the year we got married. As I read his words, I felt tears gather in my eyes. It was a love letter, but one he had never given me. He wrote about how terrified he was the night before our wedding, afraid he wouldn't be enough for me, afraid that life would somehow rob us of the happiness we deserved. Then he wrote about how he promised himself he'd spend every day proving that love to me. I had never known he carried those fears, or that he'd poured them out on paper to ease his heart. Letter after letter, I discovered pieces of the man I thought I knew completely. There were notes about our son's birth, about sleepless nights he spent worrying if he was being a good father. There were letters written after our arguments, gentle apologies he never had the courage to voice, thoughts about how much he admired my strength even when we clashed. Some letters were playful, filled with inside jokes and memories of vacations we took, moments he'd cherished enough to seal away in words. Then there was the velvet pouch. With hands that felt clumsy and heavy, I opened it to find a delicate necklace with a tiny sapphire pendant. Tucked inside was a scrap of paper where he had scribbled a short note. For your 30th anniversary. I hope it still makes you smile. I held that necklace like it was the most precious thing in the world. The thought that he'd planned a gift so many years ahead, only to never have the chance to give it to me, nearly broke me. Sitting there in the fading light, surrounded by his secret treasures, I felt the weight of how deeply he loved me, loved us even in ways he hadn't shown out loud. That old trunk, hidden away in the corner of a dusty garage, had held not just forgotten keepsakes but the very heart of my husband, patiently waiting for me to find it when I needed it most. As I sat there with those letters spread out around me, the velvet pouch still resting in my palm, something shifted inside me. It was as though the years I had spent with my husband, years I thought I already fully understood, were opening up in new, unexpected ways. Those letters brought his private thoughts into the light. They were tender, vulnerable confessions that he'd never spoken, tucked away because perhaps he didn't quite know how to share them. Or maybe he believed that writing them down was enough. Either way, discovering them was like being handed a deeper, more intimate version of the man I'd loved for so long. For the first time since he passed, I didn't feel quite so hollow. My grief had been wrapped tightly around the idea that death had cut us off, that there was nothing more to learn, no new memories left to make. But these letters challenged that. They were new memories in their own way, offering me glimpses into the thoughts he'd carried quietly in his heart. It was a gift I didn't know I was waiting for. Reading through his reflections, I saw how much he worried about being a good husband, a good father, about whether he'd provided enough, loved enough, lived enough. It struck me how alike we truly were. I had spent countless nights questioning myself in exactly the same ways, never realizing that beside me in bed was someone carrying the same burdens. We had spent a lifetime together, side by side, yet still there were parts of him that were tender and hidden, like delicate roots underground, nourishing everything we'd built together without ever demanding to be seen. There were also passages that made me laugh through my tears. In one letter he wrote after our 10th anniversary trip, he talked about how he knew he was getting older because he spent half the vacation worried about whether he'd locked the back door at home. That was so impractical to the point of worry, even in paradise. Another letter described how he felt the first time he held our son, convinced the tiny, squirming bundle would slip right through his hands. His words were filled with awe and terror all at once. It painted such a vivid picture of that day from his perspective, one I'd never truly considered. More than anything, these letters revealed how fiercely he had loved me and our little family. Even on days when we fought, when we retreated to separate corners of the house nursing our stubborn pride, his letters showed that he never stopped caring. Each line was threaded through with quiet devotion, written proof of a love that endured even our hardest moments. I realized then that love isn't always loud or showy. Sometimes it's tucked away in handwritten notes, waiting patiently to be found. Holding that necklace against my chest, I felt a strange sort of peace wash over me. This discovery hadn't erased my grief. It would never be that simple, but it had softened it, wrapped it in a layer of gratitude. My husband might be gone from this world, but he'd left behind something far richer than I ever imagined. Through his hidden words, he was still speaking to me, telling me all the things he might have struggled to say face to face. When I finally stood to leave the garage, I didn't feel like I was closing the door on him. Instead, it felt like opening a window, letting fresh air into a room I thought was sealed shut forever. I carried those letters back into the house, close to my heart, knowing I'd return to them many times in the days ahead, each reading another quiet conversation with the man who, even now, was still teaching me about the depth of love. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the garage over and over, drawn back almost by instinct. It was no longer just a cluttered space filled with old tools and half-finished projects. It had become a sacred place where my husband's spirit felt most alive. I would bring a cup of tea, pull up an old stool, and sit there for hours, reading more of his letters, turning over little keepsakes he'd tucked away, and letting memories drift through me like gentle tides. As I went through the rest of the trunk and even started sorting through other boxes, I realized how thoughtfully he had preserved pieces of our life together. There were tiny mementos that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else: a dried flower from the first bouquet he ever gave me, a ticket stub from a fair we went to before we were married, menu from a restaurant where we celebrated one of our anniversaries. Each of these simple things was a quiet testament to how much he valued our shared moments, no matter how small. It struck me that he was a man who not only lived in the present, but carried the past with him like a cherished book, pages he would reread in private whenever he needed comfort. Finding these pieces of him didn't just make me nostalgic. They gave me a new way to honor who he was and what we had together. I decided I couldn't just pack it all away in boxes or let it be swallowed by strangers through an estate sale. So I chose instead to carefully sort and keep what mattered most, not in a dusty trunk in a forgotten corner, but in our home where I could see it, touch it, be reminded daily of the life we built. One afternoon, I brought our son back to the garage. He'd flown in as soon as he could after I told him about the letters. Watching him read his father's words was one of the most profoundly moving moments of my life. There were tears in his eyes as he unfolded each letter, seeing his dad in a way he never had before. It was as if the letters offered him a direct line back to the man who had raised him, taught him, and quietly loved him in ways that perhaps neither of them had ever put into words. Together we laughed at some of the stories, sat in silence through others, and found comfort in the closeness of sharing this private treasure. Later we chose a few special items, some of the letters, that little toy truck from the shelf, the necklace, and even a few of his well-worn tools. and we created a small corner in my living room as a kind of tribute. It wasn't about building a shrine. It was about weaving his memory into our everyday lives, so it didn't sit locked away, gathering dust. Every time I pass by that corner, I feel a sense of closeness that eases the sharp edge of missing him. What surprised me most was how this process helped me heal in places I didn't even realize were still hurting. By preserving his legacy in small, intentional ways, I wasn't clinging to the past, I was letting his love continue to be part of my present. The garage, once just a backdrop to his hobbies, had transformed into a bridge that brought me back to him and allowed me to carry forward the best parts of who we were together. And so, what began as a painful duty, sorting through what was left after he was gone, became one of the most meaningful acts of love I could offer. In honoring his memory, I found a way to keep living, not weighed down by loss, but buoyed by the countless quiet ways he had loved me all along. Looking back now, I can see so clearly how this entire journey, starting from the heavy grief that settled over me after losing my husband, to stepping into that forgotten garage, and finally uncovering the tender truths he left behind, changed something deep within me. For a long time, I'd believed that healing meant trying to stitch my life back together exactly as it had been, hoping I could somehow restore what was lost. But life doesn't work that way. It moves forward whether our hearts are ready or not, and sometimes it takes an unexpected turn, offering us something profoundly beautiful right when we're convinced there's nothing left. As I settled into a new rhythm, I found myself more patient with my grief. Before, I'd been fighting it, trying to box it up so I could keep moving without constantly feeling that ache in my chest. But reading his letters, holding those simple keepsakes, and even just standing quietly in his old garage, helped me understand that grief and love are hopelessly tangled. The pain I felt was only as deep as the love we had shared. It wasn't something to rush through or ignore. It was a testament to a life genuinely lived together. I also started noticing small ways my husband was still with me. It was in the way I'd hum one of his favorite songs while washing the dishes, or how I'd smile whenever I smelled fresh sawdust, instantly transported back to afternoons when he'd come in from garage, his shirt dusted with tiny golden shavings. There were moments when I caught myself whispering little updates to him, telling him about a new flower that had bloomed in the yard or how our son was doing. They were small, almost absent-minded confessions, but they comforted me all the same. Through all of this, I came to realize that moving forward didn't have to mean letting go of him. Instead, it meant carrying him with me, allowing his memory to shape the person I was becoming. In a quiet, remarkable way, he was still guiding me. Those letters weren't just relics of the past. They were gentle instructions on how to keep loving, how to keep hoping, and how to keep finding joy even when life didn't turn out the way we planned. When friends and neighbors began visiting again, many of them were hesitant, unsure of what to say or how to act around me. I think people often fear that speaking a loved one's name will somehow reopen wounds, but for me, it was the opposite. I wanted to talk about him, to tell them about the letters and the necklace and all the little discoveries that reminded me how full our life together truly was. It helped others open up too, sharing stories about him I'd never heard before. In those moments, surrounded by laughter and bittersweet tears, I felt the quiet assurance that he wasn't gone in any way that truly mattered. What began as a painful necessity sorting through an old garage to prepare it for sale ended up being one of the most unexpected blessings of my life. It allowed me to see my husband all over again, to know him even more deeply, and to carry forward a richer understanding of what we had built together. So now, each morning when I pass by that little corner in my living room with his old tools and the toy truck and a framed letter, I don't feel crushed by absence. Instead, I feel profoundly grateful. I was loved deeply and truly, and even though the shape of that love has changed, its presence remains. And that, I've learned, is more than enough to keep my heart tender and open for whatever comes next.